The woods behind St. Clair Parish were never meant to be explored. The locals spoke of them in half-whispers, a dense tangle of oaks and swamp fog where sound went to die. Those who wandered too deep said the air changed there heavier, wetter, as if something unseen were breathing just beneath the earth. Most turned back long before reaching the heart of the forest, but the few who didn't were never the same when they returned. It started with a rumor, just another ghost story told around a campfire. 2 hikers had gone missing near the old forest road, leaving behind only a torn map and a blood-stained compass. When a search party was sent, they found a cabin no one remembered being there. It leaned crooked under the weight of time, its windows black and its door chained shut with rusted links. The trees around it were too close together, growing almost into its walls, as if the forest itself was trying to swallow it whole. The first one to enter was a young woman with a camera. She said it smelled like wet soil and decay inside, like something had been buried there for years. On the mantel above a collapsed fireplace sat a photo album, its leather cracked, its pages bloated from humidity. When she opened it, the faces stared back at her, twins, generation after generation, each pair looking more distorted than the last. Some had faces too symmetrical to be human, others with extra fingers or eyes that seemed to wander toward the lens. And written beneath every photo, in shaky black ink, was the same last name. A gust of wind slammed the door shut behind her. The camera light flickered once, then died. Somewhere in the distance, 2 voices giggled, soft and childlike. But in a place where no children had lived for nearly 40 years, that laughter didn't sound right. It sounded mirrored. And that was when she realized she wasn't alone in the cabin. The woods beyond St. Clair Parish had always been a place of quiet unease, thick with Spanish moss and shadows that seemed to move when no one was watching. It was here, on a grey autumn afternoon, that 3 hikers, Evan, Mia, and Jordan, decided to stray from the marked trail in search of an abandoned Civil War outpost rumored to be buried deep within the swamp. Their laughter echoed faintly through the trees at first, but as they ventured farther in, the forest grew oppressively silent. The air thickened, damp and heavy with the smell of decay, and the only sound that remained was the slow drip of water falling from the branches above. The deeper they went, the more it felt as if the forest were closing in around them, swallowing the light. After hours of walking, the trees suddenly parted, revealing a small clearing where something unnatural broke the rhythm of nature, a cabin. It sat crooked in the mud, its roof half caved in, the boards warped and rotted with age. Vines crawled across the windows like veins, and the front door was chained shut with rusted links that clinked softly in the wind. The sight of it felt wrong, as though it had been built there not by choice, but by force, as if something inside refused to be left in the open. Jordan stepped closer, brushing away a layer of moss from the doorframe, revealing faint carvings, symbols, crude and uneven, etched deeply into the wood. None of them recognized the markings, but they felt deliberate, like a warning. Mia hesitated, sensing something unnatural in the air. She said the cabin looked too old to still be standing, too preserved for something that should have collapsed decades ago. Evan, ever the skeptic, took it as a challenge. He circled to the back, where the boards were rotted through, and peered inside. His flashlight beam caught the edge of a table, the remains of a chair, and what looked like a child's shoe half buried in dirt. The air inside shimmered with dust, but beneath it was an odd, sweet odor, like decaying flowers. The silence was so complete it made their own breathing sound foreign, as if they were intruding on something still alive. When Evan finally forced the door open, it groaned like something waking from a long sleep. The moment he stepped inside, the temperature dropped sharply. Their breath fogged in the air. Jordan swore he heard whispering, faint but distinct, coming from somewhere deeper within the cabin. Yet when they called out, the sound stopped instantly, replaced by the hollow creak of the floorboards shifting beneath their feet. Dust motes floated through the flashlight beam like ash, and on the far wall, behind layers of grime, they saw something that froze them in place, a mirror, cracked in a perfect line down the center, reflecting only 2 of them instead of 3. The photo album lay on a small wooden table, its leather binding swollen and warped from years of moisture. It was the only object in the cabin untouched by decay, sitting neatly amid a chaos of broken furniture, scattered papers, and a layer of dust so thick it dulled everything it covered. Mia brushed her fingers across its surface, feeling the strange texture, sticky in places, as if the leather had once been wet. The cover bore no title, only the faint imprint of initials burned into the hide. She hesitated before opening it, her fingertips trembling slightly, but curiosity pushed her forward. The hinges cracked softly as the album fell open, releasing a faint smell of mildew and something metallic, like blood long dried. The first page showed a faded photograph of two children, twins, standing side by side in front of the very same cabin. Their faces were round and expressionless, their clothes clean but old-fashioned, and behind them, the trees seemed darker than they should have been. Below the picture was a date, 1912, and a name scrawled in shaky ink that had bled into the paper. The next page revealed another pair of twins, older now, but with features disturbingly similar to the first. The same symmetrical eyes, the same faint, unnatural curve to the mouths. Each page seemed to repeat the pattern, twin after twin, generation after generation, all captured in the same place, each photo growing more warped, more unsettling. As they turned the pages, the deformities became more pronounced. Some faces were too perfect, almost artificial, while others bore unnatural proportions, elongated necks, fingers that seemed to merge, and eyes set too close together. The children in the later photos looked like pale echoes of their ancestors, as if the bloodline had folded in on itself too many times. Mia's hands began to shake harder with each turn of the page. The ink beneath the later photos wasn't faded, it looked fresh, still dark and slightly raised, as though someone had written it recently. Jordan leaned closer, his breath fogging the plastic covering one of the final photos. The image showed two children again, identical and strange, with heads tilted toward each other in a way that seemed forced. But the background this time wasn't the cabin, it was the forest itself, dense and black. And there, almost invisible behind the twins, was a shadow, tall, thin, and human-shaped, watching. Evan whispered that maybe someone had staged the photos, but his voice sounded far away, muted, as if swallowed by the air itself. Mia turned to the last page and froze. There was a new photograph, cleaner than the others, not yellowed or aged at all. It showed the three of them, Evan, Jordan, and Mia, standing in front of the cabin door, exactly as they had moments ago. But they hadn't taken any picture. And behind them, in the photograph, two pale figures were smiling. The nearest town, Willow Bend, sat just 15 miles from the forest, but it might as well have been a world away. Locals there never spoke openly about the woods. When asked, they only shrugged or muttered something about the land being too old, as if the soil itself remembered things best left buried. The air carried a kind of quiet tension whenever the topic came up, a superstition woven into daily life. Shopkeepers closed early, children were warned not to wander past the creek, and the older folks said prayers whenever the wind blew in from the direction of the trees. They all knew the stories, though no one claimed to believe them, stories of voices in the dark, of names whispered softly from nowhere, and of twins born under the red light of a blood moon who never seemed quite human. When the hikers came to town seeking information about the cabin, they were met with uneasy stares. An old man sitting outside the diner watched them with pale, glassy eyes before finally calling out that some places weren't meant to be found. He told them that long ago, before the town had a name, a family had lived deep in the forest, reclusive, strange, and always coming in pairs. Every generation brought another set of twins, each more secretive than the last. They rarely left the woods except to trade small things, handmade trinkets, jars of preserves, bundles of herbs, and even then, they never spoke much. The townsfolk said their voices sounded like echoes, perfectly synchronized, as though they were one person split in two. The old man's story shifted when he mentioned the night of the blood moon. He said that was when the forest began to whisper. Hunters returning home late claimed to hear their own names carried through the trees, spoken in two voices that overlapped each other. Some said they saw shapes moving between the trunks, twin silhouettes walking hand in hand, always just out of reach. A woman swore that she'd heard a child calling her name, and when she turned, she saw herself standing there, smiling back through the fog. Mia tried to laugh it off, but her voice trembled. The man's warning felt too vivid, too practiced, like he'd said it before to others who hadn't listened. He told them the woods remember every secret ever buried there, and sometimes, when the air turns thick and the moon burns red, it whispers them back. As the hikers left the diner, the wind picked up suddenly, rustling through the trees beyond town. For a moment, all three of them paused, because carried within that sound was something soft and distant, three names, spoken twice, as if the forest already knew who they were. The midwife's name was Agnes Cole, and she was the last living person in Willowbend who had ever set foot inside the cabin before it was abandoned. By the time the hikers found her, she was nearly 90, her body frail but her eyes still sharp, the color of riverstone. She lived alone in a narrow house at the edge of town, surrounded by old photographs and bottles of dried herbs that filled the air with the scent of lavender and dust. When they asked her about the twins, she didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared past them toward the window, where the evening light flickered through the trees. Finally, she said she had been there the night the last generation was born, and it was something she had prayed every day to forget. She told them the story in a low, trembling voice. The year was 1963, a storm was coming, and she had been called deep into the woods to help deliver a child, or so she thought. When she arrived at the cabin, she found the parents waiting, but something about them was deeply unsettling. They were young, yet their faces had the same uncanny symmetry as the photographs the hikers had found, too perfect to seem natural. Agnes said they spoke little, communicating mostly through looks and quiet nods, as if they shared one mind. The air inside the cabin was thick and heavy, the walls covered with strange symbols painted in dark red. There were mirrors everywhere, cracked, fogged, reflecting light in distorted angles that made her dizzy. When the labor began, the mother screamed once and then went silent, her face pale as wax. The father stood beside her, motionless, his hands clasped tightly as if in prayer. Agnes worked quickly, but what she delivered was not what she had expected. 2 babies came into the world that night, conjoined at the chest, their tiny hearts beating in perfect rhythm. Their eyes were open before they should have been, black and still, fixed on her as if they could already see everything. Agnes said she had helped bring dozens of children into the world, but never had she felt such coldness from a newborn. The father took them from her arms without speaking, wrapped them in a blanket, and carried them to the corner where an old cradle waited, carved with those same crimson symbols. Before Agnes left, she noticed something else, a mirror directly across from the cradle. In it, she saw the reflection of the twins moving, but not in sync with the real babies. One turned its head when the other did not, its mouth curling into a faint smile. Agnes fled into the storm that night and never returned to the woods again. Behind the cabin, the ground was uneven, a patchwork of moss, roots, and soil that seemed disturbed, as though it had been dug up and filled again countless times. The hikers noticed it first when Jordan tripped over what he thought was a stone, only to realize it was the corner of a glass jar protruding from the dirt. The glass was fogged and cracked, catching the dim light that filtered through the trees. When he brushed the soil away, more jars appeared, dozens of them, buried in a loose, uneven pattern that extended almost to the tree line. None of them were marked, and all seemed roughly the same size, each sealed with a layer of wax so old it had turned gray. Mia crouched beside one and wiped it clean with her sleeve. Inside, suspended in cloudy yellow fluid, was something small and unrecognizable at first glance. But as the murk cleared, the shape began to take form, a curled body, no bigger than a hand, with delicate limbs pressed against the glass. At first, she thought it was an animal, maybe a stillborn cat or a malformed bird, until she saw the tiny fingers. 5 of them. Human. Her stomach lurched as she realized the jar held a preserved fetus, its skin pale and translucent, its face disturbingly familiar. It looked almost like one of the faces from the photographs, only smaller, softer, frozen in some silent, eternal expression. Evan tried to convince himself it was some kind of medical specimen collection, but the sheer number of jars destroyed that illusion. There weren't just a few, there were rows upon rows of them, stretching out like a hidden cemetery. Some were shattered, the liquid long dried and leaving behind nothing but shriveled remains. Others were intact, their contents perfectly preserved, as if the soil had protected them from time. The air around them was heavy and sour, carrying a faint metallic scent that clung to their clothes. Jordan, pale and trembling, started counting aloud but stopped before reaching 10. Beneath one of the broken jars, he found a small wooden cross buried in the dirt. It was roughly carved, the initials EC scratched into its surface, the same as on the photo album. Mia noticed that every jar seemed to have two fetuses inside, conjoined or positioned so closely together they looked fused. The pattern was unmistakable. Evan wanted to leave immediately, but as he stood, something caught his eye. A few feet away, one jar was half buried, its wax seal newer than the rest, the glass still clear. Inside were two small bodies, their faces more defined, their eyes shut tight. One of them had a ribbon tied around its wrist, a deep crimson color that hadn't faded at all. It looked fresh, untouched by time, as if someone had been there recently, continuing the ritual that should have ended generations ago. When the hikers brought their discovery to the sheriff's office in Willowbend, they expected disbelief, maybe even laughter. But Sheriff Alden Reeves didn't laugh. He was a heavy-set man with a quiet voice and the kind of expression that never changed, no matter what he was told. As soon as they mentioned the jars and the cabin, his eyes hardened slightly, and he asked them to lower their voices. He led them into a small back room lined with dusty filing cabinets and closed the door behind them. Then he told them that some stories in Willow Bend weren't meant to be reopened. There were records, yes, but sealed ones, forgotten deliberately. And if the hikers had truly found the cabin, they had stumbled into something the town had spent decades trying to bury. He opened a drawer and pulled out a thin, yellowing folder marked E. Calloway. The name matched the initials carved on the photo album and the wooden cross behind the cabin. Inside were old photographs, handwritten reports, and a stack of newspaper clippings so faded the ink had bled into the paper. Sheriff Reeves said the Calloway family had lived in those woods for more than a century, long before Willowbend was even founded. They were known for keeping to themselves, refusing visitors, and rarely coming into town. When the family line began to collapse inward, brother marrying sister, cousin marrying cousin, the town decided it was best not to interfere. But one night, in the early 1970s, a fire was seen burning in the trees. When deputies arrived, the cabin was already collapsing, the flames reflecting off the swamp water like blood. No bodies were ever recovered, only fragments of glass, melted jars, and the remains of a cradle half-charred by the heat. After that night, the sheriff at the time, Alden's father, declared the area off-limits. The official report listed it as an accidental fire. But among the townspeople, whispers spread that the fire hadn't been an accident at all, it had been a cleansing. Families who knew the truth made a pact never to speak of it again, swearing silence to protect the town from whatever curse the Calloways had brought upon themselves. Sheriff Reeves told them that every few years, someone disappeared near that part of the woods, a hunter, a drifter, once a young boy chasing his dog. The search parties always turned back before reaching the cabin's remains, guided by a strange instinct to leave. Reeves leaned forward and lowered his voice. He said there were places in those woods where compasses spun in circles and the trees grew in perfect, unnatural symmetry. The town had learned to live with its secret, he said. It was safer that way. Then he looked at the hikers and added quietly that it was time for them to forget what they'd found before the woods remembered their names. It began a few weeks after the hikers returned from the woods, when the town started hearing whispers again, faint stories of pale shapes moving between the trees after dark. The first sighting came from a truck driver who swore he'd seen two figures walking side by side along the forest road just before dawn. He said they were identical, dressed in torn white clothing, their skin almost glowing under the headlights. When he slowed to call out, both figures turned toward him at the exact same moment, their faces blank and smooth as porcelain. The driver didn't stop to look again, he drove straight through the fog until he reached town, trembling as he told the sheriff what he'd seen. Soon after, others began to report strange occurrences near the forest's edge. A woman hanging laundry behind her house claimed to have seen twin children standing by the tree line, watching her silently before melting back into the mist. A hunter returning from the swamp at dusk said he found two sets of bare footprints pressed into the mud, small, child-sized prints that stopped abruptly as if their owners had vanished into thin air. The townsfolk, already wary of the woods, began locking their doors earlier and refusing to venture outside once the sun dipped below the horizon. Mia and Jordan, unable to shake what they'd witnessed at the cabin, returned to the town to seek answers. Sheriff Reeves met them again, this time looking more tired than before, the deep lines on his face carved deeper with worry. He admitted that strange things had happened ever since they unearthed the jars. He told them that sometimes, disturbing something long buried doesn't just awaken memories, it awakens what was waiting with them. The townspeople started whispering about the twins again, like an old nightmare resurfacing. Some believed the Calloways had never truly died in that fire, others said the woods themselves had recreated them, shaping something from what had been left behind. Late one night, Mia parked her car near the edge of the forest, drawn by an impulse she couldn't explain. The fog was thick, the air cold and damp, but beneath it, she heard the soft sound of laughter, two voices, perfectly synchronized, echoing faintly through the trees. She called out, thinking it might be children, but the laughter stopped instantly. Then, between the trunks, two figures emerged, hand in hand. Their faces were pale, their movements slow and deliberate. As they stepped closer, the moonlight caught their features, and Mia's blood froze. They looked exactly like the twins in the final photograph from the album. Both stopped a few feet away, tilting their heads in unison, their smiles spreading too wide. And then, without a sound, they turned and slipped back into the mist, leaving behind the faint scent of smoke and decay. The next clue came unexpectedly when Jordan found something lodged beneath the warped floorboards of the cabin's front room during a return visit he made alone. He hadn't planned to go back, but the nightmares wouldn't stop. The image of those pale twins burned into his mind every time he closed his eyes. Rain had soaked the forest that day, and the air was thick with the smell of mud and rot as he pried open the cabin door. The floor creaked under his boots, and water dripped through the ceiling like slow, steady heartbeats. While sweeping his flashlight across the warped boards, he noticed a section that seemed newer than the rest, the wood lighter, recently disturbed. When he knelt down and pulled at the edges, a hidden compartment gave way, releasing a puff of dust and the faint, sweet stench of mold and something older. Inside the hollow space was a small, leather-bound diary. The cover was cracked but intact, and across the front was a name etched in faded gold: Elijah Calloway, the last known heir of the Calloway bloodline. Jordan hesitated before opening it, his fingers slick with sweat. The handwriting inside was uneven, written in dark ink that bled through the pages, but the words were clear enough to read. The diary began innocently enough, describing life in the woods, the isolation, and the belief that the Calloways were chosen by something ancient. But as the pages turned, the tone changed. Elijah wrote of voices in the forest that whispered to him at night, promising immortality through purity of blood. He wrote of his ancestors who had defied nature's order and how their children, though deformed, carried something divine within them. Jordan's breath quickened as he continued reading. Elijah described his experiments, his efforts to create what he called the perfect reflection, a child born not from the union of two bloodlines, but one folded endlessly upon itself. He believed that by marrying his own sister, he could fulfill the prophecy that haunted his family for generations. The last few pages were smudged with what looked like dried blood. They spoke of the birth Agnes Cole had witnessed, the conjoined twins, and how he had come to see them not as children but as proof that the Calloway line was nearing completion. He wrote that the blood moon would return, and when it did, the forest would awaken, reclaiming what was rightfully its own. The final entry was dated the night of the fire. The words trailed off mid-sentence, the ink smeared as if written in panic. At the bottom of the page, in darker, heavier strokes, were 4 words that sent a chill through Jordan's spine: "They are not gone." As he looked up, a faint sound came from the doorway behind him, 2 voices whispering softly in unison, calling his name from the dark. Night had fallen heavy over the woods, the kind of darkness that seemed to breathe. Jordan, unable to shake the whispers he'd heard in the cabin, had brought Mia and Evan back to show them the diary. The 3 stood in the doorway as the wind pressed through the cracks, carrying a low, constant hum that seemed to come from beneath the floor. The air inside was unnaturally cold, though no breeze entered, and the moment they stepped inside, the woods fell silent as if listening. Mia lit a lantern, its glow weak and flickering, barely cutting through the gloom. Dust hung suspended in the air like ash, swirling slowly in the golden light. Then, almost imperceptibly, the house began to move. The timbers creaked in rhythm, the walls expanded and contracted like lungs taking shallow breaths. Evan tried to rationalize it, saying the cabin was settling under its own weight, but the sound was different, wet, organic. The boards beneath their feet seemed to pulse faintly, each groan of the wood echoing like a heartbeat deep in the walls. When Mia lifted the lantern higher, she noticed something strange. The photographs that had been hanging crookedly on the wall were now perfectly aligned, every frame straight, every face inside turned slightly toward them. The twins in each photo seemed to have shifted positions, their eyes darker, more focused, and in some of them, their mouths had curved upward into faint smiles that hadn't been there before. Jordan opened the diary again to show them the entries, but as he flipped the pages, the ink appeared to bleed, letters dissolving and reforming into words that hadn't been written before. The new lines described them, the three hikers by name, their visit to the cabin, their discovery of the jars. Mia dropped the lantern in shock, and the light flared across the room, throwing their shadows across the walls. For a second, they saw movement in the reflection of the broken mirror opposite them, figures that looked like them, but slightly off. The reflections moved out of sync, smiling when they did not, blinking too slowly, their faces stretching as though pressed against glass. The humming grew louder, the walls trembling with a sound that felt alive. Evan turned toward the door, but it wouldn't open. The chain outside rattled violently, as though pulled from the other side. Then the floorboards beneath them bulged, cracking open just enough to release a breath of cold air and a faint whisper, two voices overlapping perfectly. The lantern flickered, the mirror cracked down the center, and for a moment, the reflection on the other side smiled wider. The cabin groaned again, not like wood breaking, but like something waking up, something remembering the shape of those who had come before. The storm came without warning, sweeping over the forest like a living thing, shaking the trees and drowning the ground in rain. The cabin trembled beneath its weight, the roof leaking, the windows rattling in their frames. Mia, Jordan, and Evan huddled together in the flickering light of the dying lantern, their breath visible in the cold air. The diary lay open on the floor between them, its pages turning on their own as if caught in a breeze that didn't exist. Every few seconds, lightning flashed through the cracks in the wall, illuminating the photographs that now covered nearly every surface, hundreds of them, faces of twins in every generation, and in the newest frames, their own faces staring back. The cabin had recorded them somehow, claiming them the way it had claimed all the others. Evan shouted that they needed to run, but the door refused to budge, the chain outside pulled tight. The walls seemed to breathe harder now, expanding and contracting with a slow, rhythmic pulse. Mia pressed her ear to the wood and heard it, the muffled sound of two heartbeats, perfectly synchronized, echoing from within. Then came a whisper from the darkness, soft and layered, the same voice speaking twice in unison. It called Mia's name, then Jordan's, then Evan's, as if testing how each one felt on its tongue. When the lightning flashed again, Mia screamed. Across the far wall, beneath the largest cracked mirror, were new photographs pinned in a neat row. In them, the three of them stood outside the cabin, smiling faintly, their eyes black and glassy. The wind howled through the chimney, carrying a faint scent of smoke and rot. The reflection in the mirror began to move, slowly stepping forward even though the real figures stayed still. The reflections smiled, raised their hands, and pointed toward the diary on the floor. The ink on the last page glistened wetly as if freshly written, though none of them had touched it. The words shimmered in the lantern light. Blood remembers. Flesh returns. The forest keeps what it creates. Evan lunged for the door again, slamming his shoulder against it until the chain snapped. The storm roared in, extinguishing the lantern and plunging the cabin into darkness. They stumbled outside, slipping through the mud, their feet sinking into the soaked earth. But when they reached the edge of the clearing and looked back, the cabin was gone. Only the trees remained, tall, silent, and swaying gently. Then Jordan saw it, half buried in the mud near his foot, a photograph still wet from the rain. It showed him and Mia standing together at the cabin's door, but behind them, two pale twins smiled faintly. And this time, one of them looked exactly like Mia, down to the birthmark on her neck.